After 12 lessons and many hours of study and discussion, today we finish the first major section of the book of Isaiah, the book of the King. Chapters 36 to 39 are a bridge section focusing first on the current Assyrian threat and then looking ahead to the Babylonian threat to come. We finished last week on a high note, looking ahead to the ultimate day when the ransomed of the Lord will return to Zion in everlasting joy. But Isaiah quickly brings us back down to earth in chapter 36. The year is 701 BC, and Sennacherib, king of Assyria, is knocking on the door of Jerusalem. Julia, how big a threat is this?
It is really, really big. Sennacherib has defeated all the fortified cities of Judah and is currently fighting in Lachish, which is located about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. For perspective, this would be like hearing that a massive enemy army is fighting in Paola, Kansas, and Johnson County is next. Assyria had conquered the northern kingdom of Israel over 20 years before this. Now they have also conquered many of Judah's potential allies, Tyre, Philistia, and even the Egyptian army. Hezekiah has tried sending money to Sennacherib, hoping to buy his way out of total destruction, but still the Assyrian army rolls on. For years, Isaiah has been warning Judah of the folly of trusting other nations, and they haven't listened. But now the crisis is in their face. How will they respond? Will they finally trust the Lord? Hezekiah has been king since 715 BC, taking over from his father Ahaz, who failed his test of faith. 2 Chronicles 29 tells us that Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. He began his reign by cleansing the temple, restoring true worship, and destroying the high places where false and pagan worship was practiced. 2 Chronicles 31 describes those early years of Hezekiah. He did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord, his God. And every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God and in accordance with the law and commandments, seeking his God, he did with all his heart and prospered. Hezekiah is a good king, one of the best kings in the history of Judah. But 14 years into his reign, he faces a major test. Sennacherib is occupied with a battle in Lachish, so he sends the Rabshakeh, a very high-ranking officer in the army, to Jerusalem. He really hopes that Hezekiah will just surrender and avoid the need for a long siege. And so the Rabshakeh makes a speech, first to the people, intended to confuse and intimidate and bully them into surrender. He stands by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field, the exact spot where we saw in chapter 7 that Isaiah confronted King Ahaz, challenging him to trust the Lord. The speech actually asks the right question. Verse 4, "In whom do you now trust?" But the Assyrians' point is that it would be foolish to trust their God. First, he reminds them that Sennacherib is not just any king. He is the great king, the king of Assyria. Who could stand against him? Not your words or your friend Egypt, not even the Lord your God, because Hezekiah has made him mad by removing the high places. He mistakes Hezekiah's actions as an affront to God, when actually it was an act of obedience to God. Then even if they give them 2,000 horses, a very valuable commodity in ancient warfare, they still couldn't muster enough soldiers to sit on them and fight. Finally, he attempts to convince them that their God, the Lord, has sent Assyria to fight and destroy their land. Melody, the speech is confusing, but that's the point, isn't it?
Yes. He is sowing seeds of doubt and confusion, which he hopes will lead them to despair and surrender. In verse 11, Hezekiah's officials want him to speak in the official diplomatic language of Aramaic, so that people won't understand. He refuses and speaks loudly, directly to the people. Verse 13, "Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Well, that's true, isn't it? Hezekiah cannot deliver them. But he doesn't stop there. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us. That's the lie. Don't trust the Lord. Better to surrender, and I'll treat you pretty well, making it a tolerable situation. Of course, that was an empty promise. Assyria was particularly brutal, with conquered nations, slaughtering many and leading the rest off to harsh captivity. Then his lies move on to outright blasphemy as he speaks of the gods, little g, of all the nations Assyria has defeated already. Their gods couldn't deliver their nations, and he assumes Israel's God is just like those other gods. Here we see Sennacherib's arrogance in all its glory. He isn't sending his gods to fight against Judah's God. No, he, the mighty king himself, will fight Judah's God. Huge mistake, and the ultimate sin of arrogance we saw in 14:14. I will make myself like the Most High. The people wisely were silent and did not respond. Hezekiah's officials tore their clothes, a sign of shock and grief, and brought the message to Hezekiah. Throughout the book, Isaiah has prophesied that Assyria will not take Jerusalem, that God will fight for his city and defend it. Will they trust God's word, and will God keep his promises? Chapter 37. Hezekiah responds with despair and humility, tearing his clothes and dressing in sackcloth. He sends his officials, also dressed in sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah to state the facts. This is a day of despair. We know that it is a day which they had brought on themselves by many years of disobedience. But they implore Isaiah in 37:4. It may be that the Lord your God will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that the Lord your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. It's not exactly a confident declaration of trust, but it is an acknowledgement that there is no place else to turn, and the honor and majesty of the living God has been mocked. Pray for the remnant that is left. At this point, Isaiah doesn't need to pray. He knows exactly what the Lord plans to do. Tell Hezekiah this word of the Lord. Do not be afraid. God's got it covered. Sennacherib will hear a rumor, return home, and die by the sword in his own land. Note to Sennacherib, do not challenge the living God. It will not go well for you. We discover in 37:8-9 that when the Rabshakeh returned, he found Sennacherib had left Lachish, moving on to Libnah, because just as Isaiah said, he heard a rumor that the Egyptian army, led by the king of Cush, might be regrouping to fight again. With all of this uncertainty, Sennacherib really doesn't want to begin a long siege of Jerusalem, and he's likely worried about what is happening back home in Assyria in his absence. He sends a threatening letter to Hezekiah to keep up the pressure and force him to surrender. In the letter, he again challenges the God of Israel. Shall you be delivered? Those other gods didn't deliver their nations. Julia, how does Hezekiah face this new challenge?
Really, really well. He immediately goes up to the house of the Lord and spreads the letter out before the Lord, as if to say, here's the problem, God. Rather than sending a message asking Isaiah to pray, this time Hezekiah prays himself. Oh, and what a prayer it is. I would likely at this point begin my prayer with, help me, Lord, I'm in trouble. Not Hezekiah. He begins in 37:16 by acknowledging who God is. O Lord of hosts, Lord of heaven's armies, God of Israel, God of personal relationship with your people, enthroned above the cherubim. Let's stop and ponder this poignant phrase. He is referring to the gold cherubim set at each end of the mercy seat, which sat on the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, the place where the glory of God resides. Enthroned over all, the Lord was nevertheless present at the center of his people's life. Hezekiah is acknowledging the Lord's unapproachable holiness on one side, and on the other, his presence with his people based on his covenant faithfulness. Because he is God, he can be both holy and separate, and yet faithful and present with his people. Hezekiah goes on, "You are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Those other gods don't count, because Yahweh is the one true God. You have made heaven and earth. As creator, you rule and reign over all things, both in heaven and on the earth." After acknowledging who God is, honoring and exalting him, only then does he ask God to hear and see the mocking words of Sennacherib. And even better, he declares that of course Assyria could defeat those other nations because their gods were no gods, merely the work of men's hands. The request comes in verse 20, "O Lord our God, save us from his hand." He asks not just for his own comfort and security, but that all the kingdoms of all the earth may know that you alone are the Lord. Hezekiah got it this time. God will save and protect his people because his glory is at stake. The text reads as if Hezekiah had barely finished his prayer when Isaiah shows up with the answer, 37:21. "Because you have prayed to me concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria, this is the word that the Lord has spoken concerning him." Melody, God answers prayer.
Yes, he does. This is the response of faith and trust God has been waiting to see from his people. The word of the Lord first speaks to Sennacherib in verses 22 to 29, condemning his pride and blasphemy. "Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel." Sennacherib had great pride in his accomplishments, but God makes it clear in verse 26 that he was merely a puppet doing the Lord's will. And now God is done with his arrogance. As Sennacherib led others away, verse 29, the Lord says, "I will put my hook in your nose and my bit in your mouth, and I will turn you back on the way by which you came." A very inglorious end to the vain life. In 30 to 32, God gives Hezekiah a sign that these things will come about. There will be provision now and a harvest in 3 years as the surviving remnant of God's people take root downward and bear fruit upward. The zeal or passion of the Lord of hosts will always keep his remnant and bear fruit through his people. The word concludes with a summary of God's promises in verses 33 to 35. Assyria will not come into Jerusalem nor mount a siege against it. Why? The Lord declares, "I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." God's glory cannot be challenged. God will keep his promises to his people. The chapter closes with the details of how these promises of God worked out. An angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. So Sennacherib returned home, where he died at the hand of his own sons. Isaiah is very cryptic. After all the drama, it is suddenly over when God sends the angel of death. God's honor and glory are upheld. Man's pride and arrogance are judged. But Isaiah doesn't end this section with this wonderful story of victory. Instead, he tells us of a few more events of Hezekiah's life. Julia, Hezekiah doesn't come off so well in this next story.
No, he really doesn't. And to make things even more confusing, the events of chapters 38 and 39 actually occurred before the Sennacherib story we have just finished. Remember, Isaiah isn't writing history. He is weaving a story of a nation and the king to come. Chapter 38 begins with the vague, "in those days." From the historical accounts of other books, commentators assume that this happened just a few years prior to 701 BC and the Sennacherib invasion. Hezekiah was 39 years old and he became very sick at the point of death. We learn later in the story that he had a big boil. And we don't think of that as life-threatening, but in ancient times, with no way to prevent infections, death could be the outcome. Isaiah comes with the message that this sickness would lead to death, so get your house in order. Hezekiah prays and weeps bitterly. It's important for us to read this story through an Old Testament lens. Sickness was often seen as judgment, and to die as a young man would indicate a life that was not faithful to the Lord. Hezekiah reminds God that he has walked before him in faithfulness and with a whole heart, doing what is good. He isn't claiming perfection, but he is declaring that his life has been devoted to the Lord. God hears and sends Isaiah back immediately with a new message. 15 more years have been granted to Hezekiah, and the Lord will deliver and defend the city against Assyria, the events which we have already read about in chapters 36 and 37. The Lord gives him a sign that he will keep his word. The shadow cast by the sun will move backwards 10 steps. There are some more details in the 2 Kings account, but we really don't know how this supernatural event played out. The important point is Hezekiah understood the symbolism of the clock moving back, showing God would grant him those extra years. Verses 9 through 20 are Hezekiah's own writings, mostly a lament. Remember, he has an Old Testament view of the afterlife as a vague place called Sheol. Hezekiah was grieved that he would no longer experience the life and relationship with the Lord as he knew it. He viewed death as a tent removed from its place or as a weaving cut off from the loom. Notice the repeated phrase in 13, "From day to night you bring me to an end." Hezekiah is a young man in his prime, and he can't fathom death being a good thing. Instead, he feels oppressed and bitter in his soul. In verse 17, he recognizes that this suffering was actually a good thing because he saw God's love as he delivered him and cast his sins away. He ends with confidence that he will continue, as God promised, in the land of the living, worshiping the Lord with music. Isaiah adds the note about the means God used to heal him in verse 21, a cake of figs applied to the boil, and then a reminder of the sign. Hezekiah will again go up to the house of the Lord. Perhaps Hezekiah's near-death experience actually grew his faith so that he was ready for the crisis of Sennacherib. Melody, chapter 39 shows Hezekiah in a rather negative light.
The king of Babylon heard about Hezekiah's illness and recovery, and he wants to keep up friendly relations with Judah as they're mutual enemies of Assyria. So he sends envoys with letters and a present. Hezekiah is flattered by the Babylonian visit, and as we often do when someone rather important is around, he wanted to show off a bit. So he shows the envoys his treasure house, silver, gold, spices, precious oil, and his whole armory. There is no indication here that he gives glory to anyone other than himself as the possessor of all these things. Isaiah the prophet shows up to question Hezekiah about the visit. Who were these men? What did these men say? And from where did they come to you? What have they seen in your house? Hezekiah makes it clear. I showed them everything. Isaiah knows what Hezekiah doesn't yet understand. This was a critical mistake. Judah will escape the Assyrian army, but Babylon will follow, and they will not escape. In fact, all that stuff Hezekiah showed off, and even his descendants, will be carried off to Babylon. Instead of reacting in dismay as we would expect, Hezekiah blows it off. Oh, well, it won't happen in my lifetime. Peace and security for me. All is good. Julia, this is a rather strange story and the end to this section.
Yes, it certainly is. We might want to end with Hezekiah the good king, not this flawed person who sometimes gets it very wrong. But that is exactly Isaiah's point. By showing us Hezekiah's inadequacy, he makes it clear that he is not the fulfillment of God's promises for the king who will rule in righteousness and peace. There is no final salvation in any human being, no matter how good he or she might be. He closes this section looking ahead to Babylon and the destruction of Jerusalem, which will occur 100 years later. God delivered them from Assyria, but they will fall to Babylon. Will they trust God then? Trust in God is a way of life, not a one-time experience. In the years ahead, the remnant would learn in a deeper way what trust in God was all about. And one day in the future, a child is born, a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. In the next section, Isaiah will give us a fuller picture of this promised king who will come first as a suffering servant.